In the councils of the Eastern Woodlands, an agreement could travel farther than the people who first spoke it, but only if the shell beads survived, and only if someone still knew how to make them speak. Nations placed the terms of alliance, peace, or condolence into belts woven from shell beads. A speaker held the finished belt while speaking the precise words of the arrangement. Once accepted by the receiving council, those words acquired a durable form that could be carried across distances and recalled long after the original speakers had died. The belt did not end the matter at the council. It carried the obligation forward to be reactivated whenever the beads were presented again. Before coins, before banks, belief ruled the world. This arrangement worked because the beads structured recall rather than standing as self-contained symbols. Patterns formed during weaving, rows of purple and white, blocks, paths or figures, served as fixed visual anchors. A trained speaker could later trace those patterns and reconstruct the full terms that had been deposited into the belt at the council. The system therefore depended on both the survival of the physical object and the survival of the knowledge required to read it. The system emerged among the Haudenosaunee and neighboring peoples from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic coast. Shells came primarily from coastal waters. Purple beads from the quahog clam required more labor than white beads from whelk. Inland groups obtained them through trade networks that already carried furs, tools, and other goods. Wampum belts traveled the same routes as diplomatic messengers. Artisans drilled each bead with stone tools, polished and sorted them, then wove them into strings or wider belts, creating deliberate patterns in the process. At council, the presenting speaker displayed the belt and delivered the message or agreement in formal language, lodging the content in the arrangement of beads. The receiving side accepted the belt, acknowledging both the words and the obligation they carried. The beads and patterns alone did not contain the full agreement in any self-contained script. The visual structure guided memory, but required a living speaker who had learned the specific narrative attached to that belt. Without that speaker and the chain of transmission, the belt remained a sequence of colored beads whose precise meaning could no longer be activated. This dependence on trained recollection created an early boundary. The system could record and transport agreements only as far as reliable messengers could travel, and only as long as receiving communities maintained people capable of integrating the terms into their own records. A belt carried beyond the circle of nations familiar with the protocols risked being received as an object of value, but not as a verifiable record. The practice depended on consistent access to shell materials and skilled labor for production. It depended on messengers whose passage relied on established routes and diplomatic recognition. Most critically, it depended on the continuous training of orators and keepers who could deposit new agreements accurately and reactivate older ones without alteration. The Onondaga Nation held particular responsibility for the custody of many Confederacy belts and the accurate recitation of their contents. A wampum keeper within the Haudenosaunee system was prepared from youth to recognize patterns on multiple belts and to hold in memory the full narratives and decisions each recorded. When a council required review of an earlier agreement, the keeper produced the belt. The act of bringing it forward and speaking its contents made the original terms present again. Accuracy was the mechanism that kept shared law and alliances operational across generations. The presentation of a belt did not resolve the matter at the moment of acceptance. It created an obligation that would require future councils to remember and act in accordance with what had been placed in the beads. Distance did not cancel this requirement. A belt could travel many days' journey, yet the terms remained binding on the parties who had accepted it, provided the chain of recollection held. The belts enabled coordinated governance and diplomacy across autonomous nations without a centralized bureaucracy or single written language. They allowed the Haudenosaunee Confederacy to maintain its internal structure and external relations through material records that could be carried, stored, and periodically reactivated. They supported condolence ceremonies that restored balance after loss and facilitated renewal of alliances. Yet the same features that gave the system its reach also imposed its limits. The record existed in two inseparable parts: the physical belt and the trained human capacity to read it. If either failed, if a belt was lost, or if trained speakers did not pass knowledge intact, the specific terms could no longer be verified with precision. The system worked within networks that shared both material practices and protocols for interpretation. It strained when those networks expanded or when new parties entered without equivalent training. The exchange of a belt made an agreement durable across time, but durability depended on continued social effort. Belts had to be protected from harm. Their meanings had to be renewed through periodic presentation and accurate speech. The obligation did not dissolve when the original participants were gone. It remained with the nations that had accepted the belt to be honored or formally addressed in subsequent councils. This tied the persistence of agreements to the survival of specific objects and to unbroken transmission of specialized knowledge within particular communities. As the scope of diplomacy grew and the number of recorded arrangements multiplied, the burden of maintaining accurate records through portable yet context-dependent objects increased. Beyond the scale at which trusted carriers and trained keepers could reliably operate, verification became more difficult to sustain without additional mechanisms for independent confirmation. In the next episode, we will examine how value and its transfer could be managed without requiring the recording object itself to move. Through the rye stones of Yap, ownership could change while the stone remained fixed in place, and the real record lived in the community's shared memory.